All right, so I'm going to have you begin by introducing yourself.
Hi, Sharon. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Loan Dao, and I am an associate professor and director at St. Mary's College of California in the Ethnic Studies Department or program. And I have been here for the past 3 years. I received my degree in ethnic studies at the University of California, Berkeley. And I moved back here from the New England area from a position in Asian American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. So I'm honored to be here. I come to you from Southern California today on the unceded lands of the Tongva people.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things with you. First of all, along the way, I've learned that you have we've been watching many Afghan evacuees arriving in the United States who are being called refugees. That's the name that we throw around, but we'll talk about kind of how their status might not be reflective of that title. But I also learned from talking with you that you have your own refugee story. So we're going to talk about that. And we'll save a little bit of time to talk about your book, Generation Rising. But let's start with that piece, the refugee experience. I wondered if you could start out by talking a little bit about your own refugee experience, and then we might kind of look at it in a broader context to see how this new group has some similarities.
Yeah, thank you. I am a refugee, first generation refugee from Vietnam, who came over in 1975 to the US with my immediate family. My father was in the South Vietnamese Air Force as a medical professional. And so he was able to find out that there was a good chance that the North would be invading, the Communist Party would be invading the center of the South, the capital of the South at that time, Saigon, where we lived. So for a few weeks prior to what we call the fall of Vietnam in the Vietnamese diaspora on April 30th, 1975, my father, my brothers, and my uncles started trying to plan a way to escape. And there were a couple of failed attempts. Finally, 2 days before the fall of Vietnam, my father and my 3 siblings, my mom, and then also my aunt and her 10 kids, all actually decided to just make a run for the airport, where we heard that the last planes from the US military were leaving, right? So we drove in, our car to the airport while my male cousins ran alongside the car all the way to the airport. We got to the airport and there were still South Vietnamese military military officials at the gates with their guns pointed outward. And luckily, they actually recognized my father, and so they allowed us through, but they were really not allowing others through, right? And so we stayed there in an empty house on the base from another military official who had escaped already. We stayed in his empty house on the base overnight, and in the middle of the night, my father and my oldest brother and a couple of male cousins actually went out searching for a way to escape. And they ran into a US general who actually told them the very last plane, the planes would be leaving on, the next morning. And so on the morning of April 30th, the wee hours of the morning,
1975.
1975, my father led our extended family to the tarmac, and we waited there. and there were US military officials all over the place, and they were just randomly dividing people into different lines. And my youngest brother almost was separated, and luckily he just had the wherewithal to just, break the lines, break the military, and just run back to the family. But otherwise we would have potentially been separated forever, right? We didn't have anything with us except for one briefcase that had all our documents. We were able to get on one of the last military helicopters out of Tan Son Nhut Airport in Saigon. And as we were flying up, my siblings, my family said they saw, a helicopter right ahead of us actually being shot down. And so, the vulnerability of the moment did not escape them, even as children. I was, just a very young child, so I don't have my own personal memories of this. Another thing that, my siblings would say is that they would look down, and my mom has also said this, that, they looked down on Vietnam as we were flying up, as our helicopter was escalating, and just knew in their hearts they would never see the country again. And, we had family members left. So we had extensive cousins, aunts, uncles, and our grandparents on, both sides still left in Vietnam. No one had a real chance to say goodbye to each other. We just fled, right? And so that emotional separation, I think, was just as traumatic. And then just
old were you at this time? How old are we talking?
I was not quite, or just around 3 years old. So, and for many people, it's long enough to remember, to have memories. And so I think that there's also some trauma related amnesia there for me as a young child, right? My siblings are older than me, or quite a few years older than me, and so they have very clear memories of this moment, of this period. And so our helicopter landed on a US military carrier, and we were led to, well, as we were debarking and getting on the carrier, my father at some point passed the briefcase to my mom, who was extremely nearsighted at that point, but didn't have glasses, right? And somewhere along the line, she either lost it or passed the briefcase onto someone else that she thought was within our group, within our family. And so we lost all our documents. And we had no way to prove ourselves at that point. And so we debarked the helicopter, stayed in the body of the carrier until the carrier landed in Guam. During this time, we were all, there were just thousands of people in this carrier, thousands of people who had evacuated on their own terms on this carrier, and we were just all huddled. We each had just, each family had just one mat, and we had no food. We had to buy our own food, and so we had just a little bit of money, and we were all starving, and I was apparently incessantly crying out of hunger. And so my mom just took what little money we had, went up and bought just a package of dried ramen. And that's what we split, and that's what they gave to me. And my relatives just took turns holding me, and in that time, people were dying. And my brother vividly remembers bodies being, put into bags, and just there was some sort of hole at the bottom of the ship that people were being just slid into. and we assumed that they were being just dropped into the ocean. And so it was a very traumatic experience, even just in that short trip between Vietnam and Guam. When we landed in Guam, we were put into tents, just open air tents around the base, and we were processed. We stayed, people stayed there till the end of 1975. We personally stayed there till the summer. And every day was just monotonous. There was nothing to do. There was, we felt like helpless. We were just, constantly in line. We were completely dependent. We had no way, we had no sense of control, no sense of, roles or purpose. And so we were just in lines every day to, have paperwork, to get food, to get, blankets, anything, right? Clothes. And it took us a while because, the military had to figure out who we were. And luckily, at one point, my father was trained by the U.S. military and had was sent to Arkansas to be trained by the military, along with other Southeast Asian military throughout Southeast Asia. And so there was some record in the U.S. military records of my father's identity, right? And that was the only way they were able to verify who we were. During this period in time also, the Vietnamese government was saying that they would accept anyone who wanted to come back to Vietnam. Like I said, so my mom's youngest brother came with us, and he decided that he had to go back because his wife and kids were back in Vietnam, as well as our grandmother, his mother, and he was the only son. And so my uncle went back, and he is actually part of the ship that took people back, that then immediately imprisoned people upon their return. And so he was actually in mostly solitary confinement for about 12 to 13 years. Upon his return, they claimed he was actually a spy of the CIA. And so they reneged on their promise. And so we came to the US eventually, and were, put into the one, of several military forts in the United States, in Fort Jeffy, Arkansas. And we stayed there until we were able to be sponsored out. At that time, it was mostly churches that were sponsoring people, because most individuals didn't have the monetary capacity to take responsibility for refugees. And during the time we were in Fort Jeffy, again, it was a prison-like environment. There were guards around. It wasn't clear if they were protecting us or surveilling us, right? We were, again, just completely dependent on the military for food. There was, American food that we weren't used to. So many people were just going hungry because they couldn't eat the food. We had no privacy, so there were shared showers. My mom refused to shower, so she would just take a wet cloth and just, go somewhere private and clean herself with a cloth, because, she was not used to having that lack of privacy. And we were just families all in a fort. We with shared space, so there was just a lot of noise, a lack of privacy, a sense of fear and vulnerability, and a sense of stress of, not knowing when you would be able to contact your family back home again, and not knowing what your future held, right? We were finally sponsored out by a Methodist church in Texas, and I spent most of my childhood in Texas and in small towns in Kansas and Oklahoma as well. And so we were just moving around, and we were completely dependent on the church. And we had one relative who was actually in the US prior. And so we were very lucky that they were able to give us some guidance. And my mom was able to get a job through this relative at a nail salon. And so she was one of the first people, Southeast Asian women who were recruited into what is now a booming stereotypical industry for a lot of, Southeast Asian women, particularly Vietnamese women, right? My dad had to go back to school. And so, for many, many years, we were actually very poor because he was basically just a student, right? And we were dependent on my mom's income as a nail salon. For many refugees, money didn't go directly to us, right? Any government assistance went to our sponsors, which was in this case, the Methodist Church. So we had no idea what resources were available to us, and we were just dependent on them to actually, give us whatever it is that we needed, right? In addition to that, there was a lot of pressure to go to church every weekend, even though we were Buddhist, right?
That's what I was going to ask about. Like when we think about colonialism, I'm like, I wish we had two hours just to talk about the story, because that's what I wondered about, religious identity and pressure around that. So talk about that.
I want to say they were very kind. They were very supportive. And at the same time, they were trying, I think they sincerely believed that one of the ways that they could support us was through spiritual support through the church. But for us, it was just extremely foreign. And that relationship didn't last long. And we actually, we don't know what kind of resources they continue to get, but we basically, didn't depend on them too much for a long period, for too long after we arrived because of that strained relationship, right? The other part of it was that in 1975 in Texas, you didn't have ethnic enclaves of Asian Americans. There was, nowhere to buy rice, nowhere to buy the foods we needed, no sense of community, right? We were literally pretty isolated and on our own. And luckily, through my dad's retraining, he was able to reconnect with other refugees eventually. And so there was a small sense of community amongst the refugees that my dad was connected with in Texas. But, none of us drove. We were far apart. There was just a complete sense of isolation. And when we first arrived, my first memory was being 15 people in a 1-bedroom apartment. And of course, very quickly, we got evicted from that. But we were, all the kids were sleeping on the living room floor, right? With just sheets. And I remember the first television show I watched was Sesame Street. I didn't understand anything, but I made noises as if I spoke English. And another memory that I had was, our family of 6 sharing a large order of fries from McDonald's, and that was our meal.
That is amazing. And you just hold this story deep inside of you, because I don't imagine that it just comes up very often, right? You and I have worked together for a few years, and it wasn't until we were collaborating to support, incoming Afghan refugees or evacuees. And you kind of mentioned in passing this aspect of your identity, and I wish there's so much. This is such a rich story, and it seems like you believe it, like you remember it pretty vividly, right? Even today.
Yeah, I think I remember the emotions. I remember, like I said, my first memories start when we are in the apartment in Dallas, Texas, because I think that's probably the first time in that period that I felt safe as a child. And so my first memory is watching Sesame Street.
Okay, that's so interesting. And about 47 years later or so, 46, 47 years later, we have another group. And in between, there's been other groups, but right now in particular, there's a large incoming of people evacuating Afghanistan with really similar circumstances. Like if you weren't mentioning which country and the cities, it doesn't sound all that different. The things that people have talked about, there's stories of people running for the airport, stories of people desperately hanging onto the plane and even falling to their deaths, desperation, living in military bases, having to settle with food that's not up to par, children losing lots of weight. So just on a personal level, I wonder, as you've heard some of the narratives of people who are coming in, I wonder, what does that bring up for you, as somebody who went through that more than 4 decades ago?
Yeah, it was very raw. My family members, so many refugees I know from Vietnam and Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Laos, were crying when we saw these images, when we heard these stories, when we heard the fear in people's voices right before the fall. It was just too familiar, too familiar. And so it was, I just remember growing up and always hearing these stories of, these are the lessons learned from the Vietnam War. Never again will we repeat ourselves in terms of this military loss. But I think the question, and even in terms of refugee resettlement, right? And the issues that came up around refugee resettlement, in that there was no evacuation plan and there was no real resettlement plan by the US government. And so much of it would start and stop and was inconsistent across states. And so I witnessed the same thing in terms of the experiences, the stories, the fear, the anxiety, the stress of refugees coming from Afghanistan, and also of the lack of preparation and planning from the US government, to be honest.
Yeah, and it sounds like you experienced that, and we're seeing that now. I spoke with somebody who left Afghanistan in August, and then ended up in Virginia with 50 days in Germany in between, and was trying to just make it like all of the resettlement options were already at capacity. So then their destination was Wisconsin, and it took them till mid-January, just like the other day, to get there. And yeah, I think I don't know, it's hard to reconcile. And so I guess I'm feeling like the familiarity and the narratives that I'm hearing, right? From what you're saying and from many years ago and what we're seeing now. The other thing that is really interesting to me is that we think of them and we use the term refugee, but they're evacuees, and then they're classified as parolees, meaning, and then they have under the parolee status, they get a couple of years to be in the United States, during which time the expectation would be that if they'd like to stay here, they complete X, Y, and Z processes, and then they could get on a path toward residency. I don't know, we talk about words mattering. What do you think it does when we label these people who have been refugees and have been allies to the United States in kind of carrying out their mission overseas? Like this happened in Vietnam, happened in Afghanistan, and then they come here and they're labeled as parolees, which has a connotation which makes many of us think about the criminal justice system. I don't know. How much does that title matter, do you think?
Yeah, parolees in relation to the criminal justice system, that is such an interesting idea. These labels matter a lot in terms of a legal standpoint and a policy standpoint, in that you are allowed certain protections under international law when you are deemed a refugee. And in terms of the resources that are allocated towards your resettlement and the length of stay, the ability to work, the ability to access certain privileges, and certain resources that are critical to actually rebuilding your life, and critical to being able to, like you said, get on a path to permanency in the US, right? But in addition to that, and so I'll come back to that in just a second, but in addition to that, the idea of naming someone a refugee versus something else is a political decision, right? And so we have seen over and over again the ways in which, for example, during the Cold War period, certain groups of people, such as Cubans and Vietnamese, were identified as refugees under international law by the United States because it fit into the Cold War rhetoric, right? Because what we talk about when we say refugees is that people are escaping for fear of persecution and for fear of their lives, and thus is a critique of the governments from the countries which they're escaping, right? And so this notion of identifying groups of people leaving these countries as refugees is also an inherent critique on the countries that the US was opposed to. And in the Cold War context, this fit very nicely in terms of Cuban and Vietnamese evacuees. However, for people who were coming from countries where the US government was allied, for example, in Central and South America, the government, even though their experience and their reason for leaving, the push factors, as we say in immigration studies, were identical to what many of us were experiencing who had been labeled refugees. They were not identified as refugees by the US government because they were allied with the countries in which they were fleeing. And so I want to be really clear about the experience versus the legal identification or application onto people who are escaping the country, their homelands, right?
So just a clarifying question. Oh, sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
No
I'll throw the question at you and you can keep going. So to clarify, then I just want to make sure I'm understanding you so far correctly. So refugee, by using the title, that is us, kind of us meaning the United States government saying, okay, we have a critique and we're naming that and we're going to afford you these rights. And then by not naming it as such, then the thing that I'm inferring is that they are not afforded the same rights.
Exactly. So if you look at Salvadorian refugees, right, many of them became undocumented, quote unquote, even though they were experiencing this. And we, again, to take it to present times, the past 4 or 5 years, you see people that the experiences along the southern border are basically completely different for people than, even though as hard as our experiences are as refugees, our experiences upon arrival in the US are extremely different than the people who are at the southern border, even though they themselves are also experiencing, a fear of persecution and fleeing for their lives, right? And so for many people along the southern border, their experiences would actually, I would argue, justify a legal determination of them as refugees. However, the US government will not give them that courtesy, right? And so what they are going through there is extremely different. You see the contrast, right? And so while the refugee resettlement policies in the US have been really problematic, they are also profoundly different than those of someone who is not labeled a refugee and potentially then labeled as undocumented or potentially asylees. And in this case, the difference between Afghan evacuees, parolees, is that they're having to actually prove their need to to have protection as asylees, right? And while this happened a little bit later for refugees coming from Cambodia and Laos, particularly in the 1980s with the Reagan administration, for the most part, the earlier cohorts of refugees in the 1970s did not have the same standard of burden of proof of our experiences, that we are immediately granted refugee status, right? And so the burden of proof for someone who just escaped with nothing except the clothes on their back to have to then prove somehow that they were going to be persecuted if they stayed in their country of origin is a huge burden.
So if we were to really simplify it, it sounds very opportunistic of the United States government. Is that?
I think that there are geopolitical factors that heavily weigh in on the decisions around immigration policy and practice.
Okay. And I know we only have a few minutes left, but before you go, I wanted to talk a little bit about your book. You wrote a book called Generation Rising. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about kind of what inspired this book for you, why it was important for you to write the book, and maybe give us just a little bit of a teaser.
Sure, I will try to be brief.
Okay, there's a lot to say.
Generation Rising is a book that actually, has its seeds in my experience as a student activist while I was a graduate student at Berkeley in ethnic studies. In the post 9/11 context, the United States government decided that refugees who came from 7 countries that didn't have repatriation agreements could now be repatriated to their countries of origin. And again, most of these countries were basically because that came out of the Cold War period, right? So including Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And so up until this point, I think there was this assumption that our refugee status was almost equivalent to many of us to citizenship, right? And the fact that we were suddenly, members of our community were suddenly deportable was a shock to many of us. And I think the vast majority of people who were at risk of deportation were actually people who arrived as children and who grew up in a context of refugee resettlement that actually had very little resources given to them, and in later cohorts, particularly during the 1980s, where refugee communities were actually being relocated into very hyper-policed and underserved communities where different communities of color were already fighting for resources, right? And so many of the refugee youth who were at risk of deportation were actually being caught up in the criminal justice system as well, and now suddenly find themselves deportable to a country that they actually don't remember or actually were never born in. There were people who were born in refugee camps. And so they had actually never stepped foot in Cambodia, Laos, or Vietnam, but because they were born in the refugee camps, their citizenship was still considered affiliated with those countries, right? And they had grown up in the US and really spoke very little of these languages and knew very little about the cultures, the government, etc. And so it was during this time that youth were actually emerging as a new set of community leaders in our ethnic communities, and were starting to form their own organizations. And in the post 9/11 period, you saw a new generation of Southeast Asian leaders emerging and adopting this, what I call a third space of identity, political identity formation, in that they were holding these refugee experiences related to the communist regimes in the post 1975 period, right, from their communities, as well as real critical critiques of empire, of US imperialism and military expansion, and of the resettlement process, right? That they were no longer striving for the model minority and the assimilationist goals of the previous generation of refugees. And so this book is about what led to the experiences of this new generation of Southeast Asian youth to be in the predicaments that they are in with the immigration system? And then what is their critical response that leads us to a new generation of social movement leaders in Asian America?
That's a really nice kind of way to tie it all up at the end. And I'm wondering, in the work that we do, we always talk about intersectionality. And I think we look at, even this interview is an example of the kind of the universal applicability in some ways of different issues and struggles and how they cross over. So what would you say that youth in general who might have come to this country from someplace else or might be doing the work as allies, what can this particular group of youth activists, what can they take from this book? How could they look at this narrative in this kind of documented period and apply it to what we're seeing today?
Yeah, that's a great question. A whole nother conversation potentially. So we'll have to make a second date.
We for sure will.
I think the three main things I would say is one, I look at the internal political process, political development and leadership development process within a particular organization, the Providence Youth Movement, Youth Student Movement Organization in Providence, Rhode Island, which is a largely working class, queer and cis women organization, and one of the first of its kind in the early 2000s, right? And looking at the ways in which their intersectional identities actually play into the particularities of how the organization develops and also how the members, the unevenness of the members in the organization develop based on their multiple identities as women, as queer folk, as working class people, right? Secondly, the book also looks at the, like I said, the relationships between generations of co-ethnic community members and of the Asian American and the queer and the women's movements, right? And seeing how their identities around race, class, gender, and sexuality also play into these new negotiations and conversations and strategies and tactics in the campaigns that they organize, right? And the coalitions that they form, and whether they have a voice and power at the table in terms of these coalitional spaces and alliances, right? And then I think the last thing is thinking about what does social movement organizing look like for this generation. Many people talk about technology, and I think that's one thing, and it has allowed for these youth to actually look at transnational organizing with people who have been deported in new and innovative ways that actually opens up the conversation around what Asian American movement organizing looks like today, as well as organizing for other groups. And I think finally, in terms of thinking about, up until the post 9/11 period, particularly in the 1990s, we were very issue oriented, right? So movements were actually about issues and they were siloed and segregated. And I think in the post 9/11 period, in the period of economic recession in around 2008, 2009, and then also during the Trump administration, we saw these markers where it was basically all hands on deck. We had to see our movements as intersectional and as collaborative. We had to support each other. And I think the final thing I'll say is within that narrative, we see Southeast Asian youth organizing as also understanding itself in a different positionality within the racial narrative of the United States. Particularly around, for example, the Pulse Bar massacre in Orlando, Florida, and around the Black Liberation Movement, the support for Black Lives Matter, and the murder of multiple stories and individuals that we have seen in the press over the past few years.
Thank you. And I know I have to let you go, but I'm gonna give you one more question that would lend itself to a whole nother interview date. So we'll have a future follow-up, and everybody's answer to this changes depending on what day I'm talking to them. But one of our themes that we're looking at this year is both and, yes, and, meaning
Wonderful.
And it kind of honors the multidimensionality of people. So something that strikes me about your story is in the beginning, you talked about your mother taking care of you and traveling across the world with you, and she was your caretaker. And now you're coming to me from Southern California because you are your mother's caretaker, and you're a professor, and it sounds like you have an activist past, and maybe you're still doing activism through the academy and other ways. So in doing all these different things that you do, and in having so many different kind of hats in your life, what would you say is the most important lesson that you've learned so far at this particular, from your vantage point today? Maybe tomorrow you'll have a different answer.
I think there are many answers to that. The first one that's coming to mind today is having a sense of love, working from a place of love. It's so easy to be reductive, to be angry, to to feel a sense of victimhood, right? And all those things may be true, and at the same time, if we don't allow ourselves to drive from a place of love, we are not building the world that we want to create. And I think that process is the end goal, right? So we have to actually build the world that we want tomorrow, today.
Beautifully put. And I know we have little time to spare. So thank you, Professor Loan Dao, for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you so much. If I could just do one